In a grand courtroom known for prejudice, hierarchy, and tradition, one unexpected figure walked through the gilded doors, and he wasn't alone. Pope Francis, holding a black infant in his arms, disrupted not just the order of the court, but the very idea of justice that it claimed to uphold. The moment he stepped forward, the gallery fell silent, and when the gavel finally dropped, it wasn't judgment that echoed. It was transformation. This is the story of a baby no one wanted, a system that stood in the way, and a pope who decided enough was enough. Location: Federal Court of Rome. Time: 10:58 a.m. Monday. Massive columns lined the chamber. Ornate gold trim caught the morning light. A faint rustle of papers and whispers echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. The court was in session. Robes were pressed, gavels ready, faces stern. It looked like 100 courtrooms before it, but something was different. The tension broke with the sound of slow, measured footsteps. Double doors at the back of the room swung open, not by guards, not with announcement, but with simplicity. And in stepped Pope Francis. No motorcade, no formal entrance, no press team flanking him, just the quiet weight of his presence moving down the aisle. In his arms a baby, swaddled in soft white cloth, sleeping peacefully against his chest. A black infant, fragile, innocent. A picture of contrast against the pontiff's plain white robes. The room held its breath. Judges looked up. Lawyers turned. The gallery, once murmuring, froze in silence. Cameras clicked, first tentatively, then rapidly. Reporters tried to make sense of it. But Pope Francis did not speak. He simply stood there, waiting. Waiting not for applause or command, but for the gavel to still, for the room to choose silence over sound. The presiding judge narrowed his eyes, confused. "Your Holiness, is there something you wish to present?" But the Pope remained silent, gently rocking the child in his arms. What followed wasn't spectacle. It wasn't politics. It was something older than that. Something holy. Because this wasn't just a baby. This wasn't just a courtroom. This was a parable, unfolding not in words but in presence. He didn't need to say why he was there. He was the message. A baby in a courtroom. A pope without a pulpit. The weight of centuries paused by the presence of innocence. In that moment, centuries of tradition, hierarchy, and protocol melted into the background. What remained was a question, unspoken but thunderous. Who do we protect? Have you ever seen a moment so powerful it silenced centuries of tradition? Pope Francis had followed the case closely from the start. Known for his tireless work among the poor and marginalized, he had long held that dignity was not a privilege, but a birthright. His visits to refugee camps were never for press, they were for prayer. His papacy had been shaped not by decrees, but by gestures, washing the feet of prisoners, embracing the disfigured, dining with the homeless beneath Vatican columns. So when he heard of baby Amari, left outside a refugee camp in Sicily, wrapped in a grocery bag, his cries rising with the morning sun, he was devastated. Catholic volunteers had rescued the boy. They named him, fed him, loved him. But when the adoption request reached this courtroom, it was denied. The official ruling read, "This child does not meet the identity expectations of our state." 3 appeals followed, each one rejected, each one citing cultural incompatibility. Pope Francis was outraged, though he never raised his voice. The law is not justice until it sees the child, he told his aides, and this court is blind. He knew the court well. The judge presiding had built a reputation for harsh interpretation, a man bound to tradition more than truth, to language more than life. He wore his robe like armor and rendered his verdicts with a sense of order that ignored grace. But Francis had made a decision. He would not write a letter. He would not send a delegate. He would go himself. Because if the court refused to see Amari as worthy of family, then the Pope would carry family to them, in his own arms. Have you ever felt compelled to carry truth in your arms when others wouldn't touch it? As Pope Francis stepped into the court, murmurs began to spread like ripples across water. Whispers flitted through the gallery. Judges glanced sideways, and the stenographer paused, hands frozen above the keys. "Why is he here?" a clerk whispered. Another voice followed, barely audible. "He wasn't on the docket." From the bench, the presiding judge leaned forward, his jaw tight. "This is irregular," he muttered. But the Pope paid no attention to their unease. He did not bow. He did not pause. He did not wait to be addressed. He walked straight to the center of the courtroom, past pews of startled observers and rows of attorneys now standing. No ceremony, no notes, no entourage, just him and the child. He stood tall, small feet in sensible shoes, white robes trailing, arms steady. In them, baby Amari, sleeping, unaware of the centuries of tradition cracking around him. Pope Francis held the child gently toward the room. "This child has no nation but love," he said. The room went still. The silence wasn't just audible, it was palpable. Something ancient had been interrupted. The bailiff, unsure whether to intercede or stand in reverence, hesitated before calling for order. "Silence in the courtroom!" The judge grabbed his gavel and pounded twice. "This is not procedure." Pope Francis didn't flinch. "Then rewrite your procedure," he said calmly, "before it writes off a life." No anger, no volume, just the kind of quiet that rattles stone. The baby stirred at the sound. One small fist stretched outward and fell back against the Pope's chest. The moment was unbearable in its clarity. Everyone could feel it. Something moral had entered a legal space. The judge adjusted his robe. "We cannot proceed like this." "Then perhaps we shouldn't proceed at all," said Francis, "until we remember that laws without mercy are just weapons dressed in Latin." No one moved. The court, built for declarations, had been caught in the grip of a question held not in documents, but in a child's breath. Cameras, once searching for headlines, now captured history, not through scandal, through stillness. Reporters forgot their scripts. The gavel rested untouched. Even the microphones seemed quieter. Because in the middle of the marble floor, a baby slept in the arms of a man who had nothing to prove, and everything to protect. Have you ever watched dignity walk straight into confrontation, with only mercy as its shield? The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed beneath the shadow of his polished bench. His voice carried sharp and commanding. "Your Holiness," he said, trying to reassert control, "are you seeking to intervene in this court's ruling?" Pope Francis shook his head gently, his voice low but firm. "No," he said, "I am seeking to remind you." He opened a simple folder tucked beneath his arm. No fanfare, no embossed seal, just paper worn at the edges. Inside were letters, some typed, some handwritten, some with photographs paper-clipped to the margins. Families, couples, older women, single fathers, all expressing one thing, the desire to adopt baby Amari. Each letter had been submitted, each one denied. The Pope laid them on the clerk's desk. A few fluttered to the floor in the stillness. "This court," he said quietly, "judged this child before it ever saw him." He turned, looking directly at the panel of judges. His eyes did not accuse. They invited reflection, But God, he added, never looks away. The room went still again. Then, slowly, with reverent care, he lifted baby Amari and approached the bench. He did not ask for permission. He placed the baby on the bench beside the gavel. The symbolism was undeniable. Amari, a child born into rejection, now rested at the seat of judgment itself. "If you sentence him to nothing," the Pope said, "let it be public. Let the world see what silence delivers." Gasps rippled from the gallery. A nun, seated near the back, clutched her wooden cross with trembling fingers. An attorney lowered his head. The bailiff's lips parted, but no words came. The judge's gavel hand hovered, not to strike, but as if unsure whether it still held authority. The Pope stood quietly. No words followed, no gestures, just presence. It was not rebellion, it was not protest, it was prophecy. The baby cooed, turning his head toward the soundless tension. He yawned. The image was unforgettable. A sleeping infant beside the symbol of law. Mercy resting inches from judgment. The courtroom had never seen anything like it. The judge cleared his throat, tried to gather the weight of his robe and voice, but something had shifted. He saw not an argument. He saw a child. He saw faces in the gallery no longer watching law, but watching life unfold. And in that moment, the power he wielded seemed both immense and terribly small. Pope Francis did not speak again. He had said enough. His challenge was not rhetorical. It was spiritual, and it echoed in the minds of everyone present. What do we protect? What do we preserve? And who pays the price when we fail? Have you ever felt your beliefs tremble when truth stood taller than rules? The silence in the courtroom cracked when the judge finally spoke. His voice, though formal, wavered slightly. "Are you accusing this institution of racism, Your Holiness?" Pope Francis did not hesitate. "I am accusing it of blindness," he replied, eyes steady, "and the refusal to see is its own injustice." The words did not sting like accusations. They landed like truths too long ignored. He stepped forward, not as a prosecutor but as a pastor. He began to speak, not from a script, but from memory, from conviction, from the pages of history and scripture and human suffering. He spoke of Jesus, born into poverty, fleeing to Egypt with Mary and Joseph to escape violence. He spoke of Moses, placed in a basket by a desperate mother and pulled from the river by compassion. He spoke of children left behind by governments, abandoned at borders, rejected by systems built to serve themselves. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. It stretched across the room like a blanket over a flame. It quieted not by force, but by truth. "You think justice lives in this room," he said gently, "but today she sleeps in my arms." He turned his gaze to the baby on the bench. Amari shifted slightly, still wrapped in soft white cloth, unaware that his presence had become a turning point. The judge said nothing. No one moved. But something was happening. The crowd in the gallery began to rise, not all at once, but in a ripple. A mother first, then a priest, then 2 law students clutching their notebooks. They stood, not for the judge, but for the Pope, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't stay seated anymore. Pope Francis didn't acknowledge the rising crowd. He didn't nod. He didn't pause. He simply placed his hand on the bench next to the baby and said, "This court must decide what kind of justice it upholds, one that fears difference or one that honors humanity." The gavel remained untouched. The bench had not spoken, but the silence was no longer power. It was a pause, a waiting. He continued, "If this court cannot see a child's worth beyond borders, then it does not understand justice. It only understands control. A woman in the back wept quietly. An older man crossed himself. The Pope stepped back. He did not retreat. He made space for truth to settle. And in that moment, the powerless held more authority than the powerful. A baby, a priest, a whisper that shook a courtroom. Have you ever seen the powerless hold more authority than the powerful? The courtroom held its breath. 10 full seconds passed. In a place where every word was timed and every silence filled by someone's voice, this pause felt eternal. The judge sat motionless. His hand hovered near the gavel. His eyes moved slowly, from the baby swaddled in white, to the man who had brought him here, to the heavy volumes of law stacked neatly on his bench. He cleared his throat. Not to speak, but to steady himself. "There is no precedent for this," he whispered, almost to himself. Pope Francis, standing firm in the center of the room, responded softly but clearly. "Then let today be precedent." The judge closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted, not just in his gaze, but in the weight of what he was about to do. He raised the gavel. The room froze, and then it fell. One strike, clear, firm, echoing. "Custody granted," the judge declared. "Future protections for child refugees effective immediately." For a moment, no one reacted, and then cheers erupted. The gallery, restrained for so long, released all it had held in. Tears streamed down the faces of the volunteers who had first found Amari. Reporters fumbled to capture the moment. A young law student raised her hands in silent victory. Even the court stenographer wiped her eyes. Through it all, Amari stirred but didn't cry. Pope Francis smiled gently and walked to the bench. He picked up the child, cradling him once more. The judge, visibly moved, stood as well. Their eyes met. No more words were needed, because what had been written in law had now been rewritten in love. For centuries, the gavel had ended things. It had sealed judgments, finalized orders, closed chapters. But this strike was different. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, a signal not of closure, but of commitment. Outside the courthouse, people gathered as news spread. Across television screens and phone notifications, the headlines rolled out. Pope Francis witnesses courtroom shift in refugee rights. But those who had been there would remember something deeper. They would remember the baby. They would remember the silence. They would remember how one man walked in, not to argue, but to witness, not to preach, but to carry, and how that presence had changed everything. Have you ever heard a gavel fall not to end, but to begin? News agencies replayed the moment again and again. The footage was seared into the global consciousness. Pope Francis standing at the center of a courtroom, a sleeping baby beside a gavel, and a judge whose silence became surrender to something greater. Clips flooded social media platforms. Edits layered the Pope's final words over music. Screenshots of baby Amari on the bench circulated with captions like, "This is what justice looks like." Hashtags like, "Number Justice sleeps here," and "Number Francis and Amari" trended in multiple languages. In churches and in cafes, on campuses and in parliaments, people asked, what just happened? What happened was more than a legal shift. It was a narrative rupture, a pause in the story the world had been telling itself about who gets protected and who gets left behind. Governments faced mounting pressure. Petitions surged across borders. Some countries announced immediate reviews of their refugee and adoption policies. Others reopened closed cases. A few created new departments focused specifically on stateless and vulnerable children. The international media covered the courtroom's response, but the public focused on the Pope's entrance, not because he won an argument, but because he carried something sacred into a place built for judgment. Academic institutions responded in kind. Law schools assigned students to write on what had transpired. Within a week, dozens of new theses bore titles like The Baby in the Courtroom, Moral Authority versus Legal Authority, and Mercy as Precedent. One student opened their paper with a line that resonated far beyond the classroom. There was no objection because the objection had been our silence. In theology schools and ethics seminars, professors pointed to Pope Francis's presence as a case study in prophetic witness, not through condemnation, but through companionship. Meanwhile, artists took to murals and sculpture. In Buenos Aires, a wall was painted with an image of Francis holding a mare above a broken law book. In Nairobi, a street poet recited verses titled, Where the Gavel Cried. Letters arrived by the thousands at the Vatican, from parents, teachers, doctors, students. Some included drawings of babies in courtrooms. Others contained checks made out to refugee aid groups. Most simply said, "Thank you." In Italy, a grassroots movement emerged, citizens volunteering at overwhelmed immigration centers. Some volunteers handed out shirts with the phrase, "Justice sleeps here." The moment had become more than a memory. It had become momentum. And people, everyday people, began asking a new question. Who are we really defending when we say the law? Are we guarding tradition? Or are we upholding truth? Is justice a sentence? Or is it a child no one else is willing to hold? Policymakers and priests, activists and judges, skeptics and believers, they were all asking it now. And in that chorus of reconsideration, something softened. Not just systems, hearts. Because the moment wasn't about power. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about proximity. One man walked through a door, holding love in his arms, and the room could no longer pretend it hadn't seen it. The ripple didn't stop at Rome's courthouse steps. It reached classrooms, governments, kitchens, and prayer circles. It reached those who had long stopped believing that change could come without violence or victory. Have you ever seen the world shift because someone carried love through a courtroom door? Pope Francis never spoke publicly about the courtroom moment again. No press conference, no formal address, no victory lap. He simply returned to his daily rhythm, visiting prisons, blessing infants in hospitals, walking through alleys others overlooked. But the world noticed what he left behind. Amari's name began to appear quietly in Vatican bulletins, not in headlines or homilies, but in footnotes and acknowledgments. Mentions of a child adopted by a family in Florence. A letter of thanks received from a mother with a short, handwritten note from the Pope attached. Let love raise him. His new family never gave interviews. They said Amari's story didn't belong to the news. It belonged to grace. Yet the echoes continued. In the very courthouse where Amari once slept beside a gavel, a mural now fills the lobby wall. It shows Pope Francis, robes flowing, holding a baby high in the light of a stained glass window. The baby's eyes are closed in peace. Behind them, the outline of the bench, transformed into a cradle. Beneath the mural, etched in bronze, justice is not blind. It just forgot how to look. Visitors pause there now. School children on field trips, judges before their hearings, lawyers with clients. Some pray, some cry, all remember. The mural became more than decoration. It became mirror and message. And inside the chambers of that court, change unfolded not in grand reforms, but in quiet shifts. The court instituted quarterly reviews focused on ethics and equity. These weren't just procedural updates. They invited reflection. Each quarter, judges gathered, not to revisit rulings, but to examine whether they had listened well, whether their decisions made space for dignity, whether their robes had come to feel like barriers or bridges. One senior magistrate, once known for rigid rulings, began his sessions by reading letters from children in the foster system. Another proposed a new clause in family court, that every child in a contested case be shown a photo of Amari and asked what they saw. Some scoffed, others changed. The court didn't become perfect, but it became honest. And the stone walls that once echoed with formality began to murmur with humanity. The story reached far beyond legal chambers. It became required reading in seminaries, a case study in business ethics courses, a parable retold in Sunday schools and secular podcasts alike. In Florence, Amari grew, quietly, joyfully, in a home that was not built on rulings or reviews, but on belonging. He doesn't remember the courtroom, but the world does. Because in a place built to render verdicts, something unexpected happened. A verdict was rendered not by law, but by love, and it left a legacy without needing words. Have you ever seen stone walls turn into open arms? Today, Amari is thriving. He runs through sunlit halls in Florence. He colors outside the lines. He climbs trees in a backyard that now belongs to him. He laughs at nothing and everything, like children do when they know they are loved. He doesn't remember the courtroom, the columns, or the cameras. He doesn't remember the gavel or the moment his future shifted. But the world remembers. And so does the conversation his presence started. Law schools still teach his case. Community forums revisit it during ethics panels. Parents use it to talk to their children about what it means to stand up for someone who cannot stand up for themselves. In churches and mosques, in lecture halls and legal chambers, people still ask, how do we build a system that protects without punishing, that upholds the law without folding under it? And when the question turns to Pope Francis, the story deepens. He was asked, months later, quietly, away from microphones, why he did what he did. Because love unspoken is law unkept, he said. Simple, unshakable. He was also asked if he believed baby Amari changed the court. He shook his head. No, he said. He changed their hearts. The court just followed. That sentence, like so many of his others, echoed. It became sermon and speech. It became headline and hashtag. It became reminder. A reminder that laws may govern, but love transforms. And that transformation does not begin in institutions. It begins in people. In the courage to carry what matters. In the stillness to witness pain without turning away. In the decision to act when silence seems easier. Today, the mural still hangs in the courthouse lobby. The reviews on ethics still occur. But more than that, a spirit remains, a willingness to ask not only what the law says, but what it forgets to see. And in homes like Amari's, across countries and borders, new stories are being written, stories where compassion is not a cameo, but the center, where justice wears a softer face, and where babies like Amari don't just survive, they lead the way. So, if you're wondering whether one act of compassion can confront power, remember this story. Remember that day in court. Remember that one man walked in without a legal argument, but with something far more dangerous. Hope. Because somewhere right now, someone is still waiting to be seen, and someone else is holding the gavel. The question is, will they lift it to judge, or will they use it to begin? If you believe one act of compassion can confront power, share this story. because the next Amari is already watching.